Today, Mort Janklow has an office high above Park Avenue, filled with gorgeous works of modern art, a Dubuffet, an Anselm Kiefer. He tells hilarious stories. My mother had 2 sisters. One lived to be 99, the other died at 90. The 99-year-old was a smart woman. She married my Uncle Al, who was the chief of sales for Maidenform. Once I said to him, "What's the rest of the country like, Uncle Al?" And he said, "Kiddo, when you leave New York, pushcart peddler." He sold towels and tablecloths without much luck. He switched to notebooks, then bananas, then socks and stockings. Was there really a future in pushcarts? Regina gave birth to a second child, a daughter, and Louis's urgency grew. He now had 4 mouths to feed. The answer came to him after 5 long days of walking up and down the streets of the Lower East Side, just as he was about to give up hope. He was sitting on an overturned box, eating a late lunch in the Polish town of Brzeżko. When the opportunity came to work in Schnittwarenhandlung, literally the handling of cloth and fabrics, or piece goods as they were known, he jumped at it. In those days, the piece goods man was clothier to the world, he writes. And of the 3 fundamentals required for life in that simple society, food and shelter were humble. Clothing was the aristocrat. Practitioners of the clothing art, dealers in wonderful cloths from every corner of Europe, status back in Poland. There, Borgenicht asked for a salesman who spoke German, since his English was almost non-existent. He had in his hand his and Regina's life savings, $125. And with that money, he bought enough cloth to make 10 dozen aprons. Day and night, he and Regina cut and sewed. He sold all 10 dozen in 2 days. Back he went to Claflin for another round. They sold those too. Before long, he and Regina hired another immigrant. Borgenicht realized that his only chance to undercut bigger firms was to convince the wholesalers to sell cloth to him directly, cutting out the middlemen. He went to see a Mr. Bingham at Lawrence & Company, a tall, gaunt, white-bearded Yankee with steel blue eyes. There the 2 of them were, the immigrant from rural Poland, his eyes ringed with fatigue, facing off in his halting English against the imperious Yankee. Borgenicht said he wanted to buy 40 cases of cashmere 7 days a week. They jumped at the chance. Hard work is a prison sentence only if it does not have meaning. Once it does, it becomes the kind of thing that makes you grab your wife around the waist and dance a jig. The most important consequence of the miracle of the garment industry, though, was what happened to the children growing up in those homes where meaningful work was practiced. Can you imagine what it must have been like to watch the meteoric rise of Regina and Louis Borgenicht through the Louis Borgenicht? One flight up from Flom's corner office at Skadden is the office of Barry Garfinkel, who has been at Skadden nearly as long as Flom, and for many years headed the firm's litigation department. What did Garfinkel's mother do? She was a milliner. She made hats at home. What did 2 of Louis and Regina Borgenicht's sons do? They went to law school, and no less than 9 of their grandchildren ended up as doctors and lawyers as well. The most have been born in the early 1930s. But if you have all 3 advantages, on top of a good dose of ingenuity and drive, then that's an unstoppable combination. That's like being a hockey player born on January 1st. The BlackRock firm is Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen, and Katz. The firm's first partner was Herbert Wachtell. He was born in 1931. He grew up in the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union housing across from Van Cortlandt Park on small farms in the valleys. They made whiskey in backyard stills and felled trees, floating them down the Cumberland River in the spring when the water was high. Until well into the 20th century, getting to the nearest train station was a 2-day wagon trip. The only way out of town was up Pine Mountain, which was 9 steep miles from bottom to top on a road that turned, on occasion, into no more than a muddy, rocky trail. Harlan was a remote and strange place. Who was responsible for an awful lot of the violence probably belonged behind bars. But what happened in Harlan wouldn't become clear until you looked at the violence from a much broader perspective. The first critical fact about Harlan is that at the same time that the Howards and the Turners were killing each other, there were almost identical clashes in other small towns up and down the Appalachians. In the famous Hatfield-McCoy feud on the West Virginia-Kentucky border not far from Harlan, Serp Square, or most frequently on a grazing boundary, where a curse or a stone aimed at one of his straying sheep by another shepherd is an insult which inevitably requires a violent response. So why was Appalachia the way it was? Because of where the original inhabitants of the region came from. The so-called American backcountry states, stretching from the Pennsylvania border south and west through Virginia and West Virginia, Kentucky and Tennessee, north. Only in a culture of honor would it have occurred to the irascible gentleman that shooting someone was an appropriate response to a personal insult. And only in a culture of honor would it have occurred to a jury that murder, under those circumstances, was not a crime. I realize that we are often wary of making these kinds of broad generalizations about different cultural groups, and with good reason. This is the form that racial and ethnic stereotypes students to read the following story and supply a conclusion. It had only been about 20 minutes since they arrived at the party when Jill pulled Steve aside, obviously bothered about something. "What's wrong?" asked Steve. "It's Larry. I mean, he knows that you and I are engaged, but he's already made 2 passes at me tonight." Jill walked back into the crowd, and Steve decided to keep his eye on Larry. Sure enough, within 5 minutes, Larry was reaching over and trying to kiss Jill. The social and demographic conditions that spawned them have vanished, and they play such a role in directing attitudes and behavior that we cannot make sense of our world without them. So far in Outliers, we've seen that success arises out of the steady accumulation of advantages. When and where you were born, and what your parents did for a living, and what the circumstances of your upbringing were like, all make a significant difference in how well you do in the world. The question for the second part of Outlining: an oil pipeline and snapping pine trees before falling into a ravine and bursting into flames. By the time rescue workers reached the crash site, 228 of the 254 people on board were dead. 20 years before the crash of KAL 801, a Korean Air Boeing 707 wandered into Russian airspace and was shot down by a military jet over the Barents Sea. It was an accident, meaning the kind of rare and catastrophic event